We're back at FrightFest UK, and I am joined by Sarah Appleton and Philip Escott, the co-directors of new horror documentary Generation Terror. Tell me, you two, why did you decide to make this documentary?
For us, it's very much an era that hasn't been as discussed. So it's an era that we grew up in, so we were there for it. But when you think horror, a lot of people think the 70s, the 80s, but we think this era is well worth investigating.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was the era I grew up with. I loved Wrong Turn and The Ring and all this sort of thing. When I was growing up, I was like a kid, literally like 10. And I just don't see anyone really talking about that era at all. Like, it's still, everyone's just like the 80s, like not even the 90s. And I'm just like, mate, it's been 30 years. Let's talk about this era, you know?
There are so many great horror films that came out during this period of time, and you guys got to work with some amazing filmmakers on this. Did you learn anything in the process of making this that you thought everyone needs to hear this, but it didn't make it into the final cut?
There was a section about how important DVDs were, because that was our era. And yeah, it just didn't really gel with the rest of the movie. So yeah, that hit the cutting room floor.
Yeah, definitely. There's a huge element of the industry change in this era. For instance, also film festivals, like genre film festivals, the rise of them, and like talking about the industry stuff kind of felt a little bit dry maybe, and want to keep it with the films rather than the industry.
This film covers the early 2000s. What do you think is to come in the next generations of horror?
I don't know. I mean, if what this film is saying, which I totally believe is correct, which is obviously that society reflects movies. You know, you look at the paranoid movies of the 50s, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and then the period where I started making movies was all around the post 9/11 period.
What about this era do you think was so important to yourselves and to horror in general?
Oh, for me personally, I mean, I was born in the 90s, but I came of age, started watching these films in the 2000s, and a lot of these were very bleak, gory films, and I remember being like, oh, this isn't like the 80s style Evil Dead films that, you know, my dad used to watch. So for me personally, coming aboard the project was like I grew up in that era, I knew about it. I think in terms of what it means to the larger stage of horror, I think 2000s horror gets very unfairly maligned because everyone wants to talk about the 70s and the 80s, and the 2000s kind of gets pushed into the corner, which is unfair because there's so much treasure in there. Yeah,
Agree.
Yeah, much like Amber, I was coming of age around this time too, and a lot of these films from the early 2000s were some of the first horror movies I had my hands on, so they'll always have a special place in my heart, but I think they get ignored academically a lot, even though they impacted what came next and they have a lot to say themselves, so I'm really glad they're finally getting some attention.
I think obviously the political landscape was really, really important, but I think coming off the back of the 90s, we hadn't seen horror films that were really shocking. And in the 70s, we'd had that shock value. It'd been really controversial. We'd had the nasty era of films, you know, banned films. And we kind of hadn't had that for a while. So then when we headed into the 2000s, we started seeing that this depraved element of films, these controversial films that really shocked the audience, came back. And I guess it captured the attention of the audience, finally.
Thank you two so much for the gift of this film and for chatting with me. Congratulations.